Good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Zimkus once again. I am the Historian and Education Director of the Warren County Historical Society and of the Harmon Museum, and I have the privilege of being your speaker today. I did teach school here in Lebanon for 35 years, as I mentioned earlier. I am also the house historian of the Golden Lamb, so on many a weekend you might see me visiting people at their tables or lectures being given there. We're going to talk about today Beedle Station, what it was and what it possibly can be. Beedle Station is the first settlement in the Sims Purchase in Warren County. The first permanent settlement in Warren County, and arguably the first settlement in Warren County, although Mount Station in south of the Little Miami River was also founded in September of 1795. Back in 2004, I got a phone call from a lady named Laura Orahosky. She was the business administrator for the Lebanon Correctional Institute, LCI. And she told me there is a farmhouse on their property which has a log cabin inside of it. And would I like to see it? And could we possibly save it? So I went to visit them one morning. I got in a special vehicle for the prison. I was in the back seat. I couldn't get out without help. And so I'm sitting in this back seat, and we go about a mile south, and we travel. Let's see here. This is an 1875 map of Lebanon, and this is 63. So LCI is right about here. So we travel about a mile south into what is now section 28. Now on this map, we're talking about going down from LCI right there to about right over there. There was, we entered a two-story structure from the north, which was the back door. This part of the building and the section to the west had been added to the main structure. The house was evidently used well into the mid-20th century, since it still possessed an aluminum TV antenna on the top. The house had remnants of a front porch that faced south. However, at that time, it was inaccessible due to the overgrowth of honeysuckle. The building had gaping holes in the roof, walls, and floor. Due to the extreme poor conditions, many of the interior walls in the main and oldest part of the building were exposing hewed logs. The area was approximately 18 by 24 and was 2 stories in size. The exposed logs were in some cases in excess of 18 inches in diameter. These were big trees. All the timber showed scoring marks from the axe. Because of this, it was concluded that the central part of the frame was built circa 1800. In the fall of 1795, William Beetle did travel with his family up to section 28 and established a community known as Beedle Station. Skipping a few years, on November 30th of 2018, Wanda Hedges passed away, the wife of local attorney Jack Hedges. Early that year, at 2019, Jack was thinking of doing something as a memorial for Wanda, and he contemplated getting a log cabin and establishing it on, it's considered a park, but it's a vacant lot next door. He was looking at going to Kentucky and spending thousands of dollars to have an old cabin brought up here. It was our executive director, Vicki Van Harlingen, who suggested it to him. Well, there is a cabin 3 to 4 miles where you are right now, which has historical significance. Why don't we think about moving that? Jack liked the idea. The city was approached. The city would donate that park. Jack would finance about half the movement. Bruce Stewart, an architectural reclamation, he has worked with the Newcomb Tavern at Carillon Park and with the old log cabin post office in Franklin. He has agreed to be the engineer, which would assess the building, what logs have to be replaced, the entire roof pretty much so. The deconstruction, the replacement logs, the moving, the foundation needs, and eventually the reconstruction. Several businesses have asked or said we would help. One contractor did offer, we'll see if that pull seems to be true, but he did offer to give 60 men one day to work on this project. We need your help. On your desk table, there is this Beedle Station log cabin. Yes, I can help with donations, so think about that. We have here some pictures. Our good friend Dwight Rowe has volunteered to work on this, and this is the house. All that honeysuckle has been moved away. This is a side view of it, and this is the kind of notching it has. It seems to be, by my estimation, what is referred to as a sharp notch, but a hewed version of a sharp notch, which is this kind over here. I have over here some examples of how logs were hewed, and I have an example of a broad axe and a felling axe. Dwight is also a metal detector and archaeologist, if you will, and he has searched around that, and he has been kind enough to bring some of his things he found there, and some of them are an 1868 part of a lamp, an axe head, a hand-hewed barn hinge, and a 19th century penny. He's even found some Hot Wheels, which may be 50 or 60 years old. He did mention, he's going through there with his metal detector, and there was a corrections officer from the LCI there, and Dwight did say, are you allowed to bring guns into the LCI property? And he said, no. And so Dwight said, will I be arrested for finding this? So like I said, it was used much into the 20th century. What I'm going to do now is tell you a little about why Beedle Station and the Beetle family is so important. William Beetle was born in Morris County, New Jersey. The date of his birth is, some people say it was 1735, other people say it was 1727. I do think it was 1735. Less than 30 miles away from New York City in the Passaic River Valley. He, in New Jersey, spelled his last name this way. He had one brother and several sisters. When he first comes to the Northwest Territory, he is spelling his name this way, B-E-D-L-E. And then by the time he dies in 1814, he's spelling the name this way. So there's a variety of different ways the name is spelled, but he is William Beetle. He's listed among one of the early lot owners in Los Santoville, the original name of Cincinnati. That was in 1789. In October of 1792, while living in Cincinnati, he sells to his brother-in-law, Nathan Little, his property in New Jersey. In August of 1795, the Native Americans of the Northwest Territory signed a peace treaty under the watchful eye of General Mad Anthony Wayne, and the Northwest Territory is open for settlement. Prior to that, it was often referred to as the Miami Slaughterhouse. It was a very dangerous place to be. Beetle is said to have waited for time to move up. Now he is, at this time, about 60 years old. His wife is about 56. They have 5 adult children, 4 daughters, and 1 son. The oldest daughter is 36. Their 1 son is 26, and the other daughters are in between. He follows a party of surveyors led by a Captain John Dunlap on September 21st of 1795. They follow the old Harmer's trace. In 1790, General Josiah Harmer and 1,400 men are making their way up through what would someday be Warren County, staying a little bit to the west of the Little Miami River, then veer off to go through what would someday be Lebanon, and then eventually make their way up to what is now Fort Wayne, Indiana, where they were soundly defeated by the Native Americans under Little Turtle. But they follow that, and then his family with their wagons veer off. When you have 1,400 men going through, first off, they're chopping down trees. And as you know, whenever we were going to school, if there was a shorter path to the school door, you made a path through the lawn. And there was a new, Lebanon High School, the old Barry, has several sidewalks which were developed because people used that. Made their own sidewalk. So one of the first things he does is he builds a blockhouse. Since the Treaty of Greenville is only a month old. Now, this is a drawing of what a blockhouse might have looked like. There is no true description of what this blockhouse looked like, but Josiah Morrow, the grandson of Jeremiah Morrow, the governor of the state back in, and first U.S. representative from Ohio. In 1913, Josiah was the premier local historian of this area. He did write in 1913, the Beetle blockhouse was probably the last of its kind constructed in the territory comprising within the 3 counties of Hamilton, Warren, and Butler. None of the pioneers, so far as I know, have left a description of the building, its size or manner of construction, except with the statement that it was constructed of round logs. But a full description of a blockhouse erected in the Sims Purchase in November of 1788 was written about by a man named Thomas Gregory, who lived in it from 1832 to 1834 when he was a boy. This blockhouse was near Columbia, where Lunken Airport now is. The description of that blockhouse was the blockhouse was 18 feet wide and 24 feet long. The building was constructed of round logs around the size of a man's body, unhewed by knots together at the corners. The attic projected over the low story and was protected with porch or loopholes for rifles. A large stone chimney stood in the middle of the gable. The front of the house facing the Ohio River had a window and a door in the lower story and a small window in the attic. There was a window opening in each side of the house in the back room and another small window in the attic facing away from the river. The door was heavy, one secured by a bar, and the windows were protected by solid plank shutters. So this is the kind of thing that he built there. Now, he officially buys all of Section 28, which is this right here, and the one I've marked off over here, for $250. 640 acres, about $9,500 in today's money. All of his children are married. Susanna married a man named Jonathan Davis. Phoebe was married twice, first to Charles Johnson, who passed away, and she had several children by him, and then to Caleb Mulford, whose name is still around the area. Lydia was married to Elijah Davis, who was Jonathan Davis' brother. Mary, also known as Polly, was married to Daniel Hull. His brother was Dr. John Hull. Those of you maybe from Centerville may be familiar with Hull Creek or John Hull School, or even the community near Miamisburg referred to as Hull Station. And then James, the only son, was married to Nancy Oakley. It was a prominent place. Coming from Centerville, coming down what was originally called Deerfield Road, basically 48, which went from Dayton all the way to South Lebanon. Whose original name was Deerfield, although it didn't go all on 48. He goes down 48, and then it went down what is today Bunnell Hill, and then going from Bunnell Hill through here. But getting away from the 48 part, Sheehan Road, which is not too far from the restaurant Archer's and near where the old Elder Bourbon Centerville used to be, was called for many years Beedle Station Road. Going from the south, coming north, Old Hamilton Road, the old Cincinnati-Lebanon Road, was also referred to as Beedle Station Road. As late as 1831, they were still calling it Beedle Station Road. In 1798, a church was established in Section 29. Now, Beetle is over here in Section 28, all his property. North of that, where this green dot is, that is where the Turtle Creek Presbyterian Church was established, right about over there. This is Beetle's property, and that's where the church was established. Interestingly enough, that property had no transactions. If you go to the Warren County Recorder's Office, it simply has at the top of the page 1794-1846 reserved for religious by Congress for religious purposes. So no one owns that technically except for the church, perhaps, under that circumstances. The Reverend in 1798 was the Reverend James Kemper, the same person whose family Kemper Road, perhaps even him, is named after. He was considered a highly esteemed preacher and highly esteemed as a preacher and as a man. Beetle was one of his elders of his church. They had a heated dispute over a property line. Mrs. Kemper's bonnet was also said to be too costly and stylish. So he was eventually asked to leave. He later on once said Richard McNamara stole his congregation. Also settling in the area were two other people named Beetle. There is some misinformation out there. Francis Beetle, probably the most famous of the two, was not a brother of William Beetle. He wasn't even a cousin or a nephew of William Beetle, but or at least a first cousin. I do believe he's a relative somehow. Most records say he was born in New Jersey in 1758. So we're talking 20 years after William Beetle. It was recorded that he moved to Pennsylvania with his father in 1775, that he was a volunteer during the American Revolution and was involved in several skirmishes, including the famous Crawford's defeat, and there where Crawford County is today, and the torturing of Colonel William Crawford. He was at one time captured by the Indians in 1795 and spent several months living as a prisoner until being rescued and coming back from the Niagara area back to this area. And in 1795, he buys a small piece of land, which is right over there. That little blue square was Francis Beetle's. There was another Beetle, and his name was Joseph Beetle. Now, he is said to have been born in 1749. Now, some sources say he was born in Pennsylvania. Other sources say that is not true. He was born in New Jersey, and they say he was Francis Beetle's brother. So if there's a connection, it would be Joseph Beetle and Francis Beetle. Now, Joseph owned, about 100 acres right up there, which would be in this general area over here. Now, he only lives there for a while. He sells the property by 1810. One of his children is Samuel Beetle Sr. He moves away and he goes to Miami County in Ohio. And then his son, Franklin Beetle, moves away, and he goes to St. Clair County, Illinois. And his son, Walter Beetle, moves away, and he moves to O'Fallon, Illinois. And then he has a son named William Franklin Beetle Sr., and he moves to Pasadena, California. And he has a son named William Franklin Beetle Jr. He's born in 1918, and he becomes actor William Holden. Now, I told that story to some friends in Rotary, and I'm telling them, and then he becomes William Holden, and you could hear crickets. My fellow Rotarians, it was a younger crowd. They had no idea who William Holden was. Now, and I said, Starlock 17, Sunset Boulevard, picnic, nothing. Now, interestingly enough, William Holden's great-grandfather, Samuel Beetle Jr., had a younger brother named Solomon Beetle. And Solomon Beetle married Mary Tingle, the older sister of Aseneth Tingle, who was William Elmer Harmon's grandmother. So William Elmer Harmon, the man the Harmon Museum is named after, and William Holden are cousins. I mean, I don't know what you would call them, but Harmon's great-grandmother was William Holden's great-great-great-great-aunt by marriage. Okay. So, Richard McNamara, or if you're from the East, McNemer, from what I understand, the British or English pronunciation is McNamara rather, and the American pronunciation is often McNemer, but at least that's what I try to figure out, which was the correct at one time. He was a Presbyterian minister, well educated, part of the Great Kentucky Revival in 1801, where many a Baptist and Presbyterian minister preaching fire and brimstone, and hope that's not me. No. Nope, it's not me. Good. And he comes and he has the Turtle Creek Presbyterian Church, which was one of the largest, if not the largest, north of Cincinnati. It was a powerful church. And then around June of 1805, he and practically the entire congregation broke away to become part of a group known as the New Lights. There was a disagreement in the teachings of the Presbyterian Church. This is the parent movement of what was referred to later as the Christian Church or the Disciples of Christ. Then, a few months later, on March 22nd, three men, Ezekiel Bates, Benjamin S. Young, and John Meacham, arrive in the neighborhood of McNamara, and they visit a man named Malcolm Worley. Malcolm Worley, on this map, McNamara lived right over there. That's his property, and Worley owned this property. The Lebanon, the Audubon would be right about there. And over here we're talking Audubon and their property being right about over here. They tell them about the Shakers, founded by Anne Lee, born in 1736 in England. Her father was a blacksmith, and she was a young woman, worked in a cotton factory. She was said to be illiterate. She also cut fur for hats. Uncomfortable with her sexuality, she was often repulsed by sexual activity. Eventually, her dad forced her to marry a man named Abraham Standley, and they were married in 1761. She was pregnant 8 times. 4 of the births were stillborn, and the other 4 living children, none of them lived past the age of 6. She was imprisoned once for her religious belief and believed that she had a revelation that the Spirit of God was now within her, and she was chosen by the Society of Followers to be Mother of Spiritual Things, and she called herself Anne the Word, or Mother Anne. Part of their experience was shaking and trembling caused by the sin purging from the body. In 1774, United Believers in Christ's Second Appearance, shaking Quakers by people making fun of them, they started answering to the name Shakers, moved to the colonies. They arrive in New York City on August 6th of 1774. After spending 2 years in New York City, they move up to the Albany, New York area. By this time, her husband, Abraham, had deserted her, and she and a handful of her followers began a settlement known as Watervliet, the first settlement in the West. I'm sorry, the first settlement in the North, in the Americas. The Shakers who visited talked about Anne Lee, heard the 4 disciplines, the period of time during which God has gradually unfolded to his plan of salvation. It revealed that although the New Light revivalists talked of salvations, the Shakers, with the second appearance of Christ, had already achieved actual possession of salvation. There was the 4 basic principles: virgin purity, Christian communism, confession of sins, and separation from the world. Malcolm Worley was said to have turned to them after spending all night listening to them, "Brethren, are you there?" To which they replied, "We are." And then grasping their hands, he said, "All I have is yours." Shaker historians in 1904, Anna Wright and Leah Taylor referred to Malcolm Worley as a deep thinker on great themes, intensely and actively interested in religious matters. The non-Shaker observer observed in 1882, he had an excitable temperament that led him to such wild exercises during revivals that many doubted his sanity. He is the first Shaker of the West. The second Shaker of the West is a 19-year-old freed former Virginia slave named Anna Middleton. She's the first female Shaker of the West. She's the first African-American Shaker of the West. She was received, according to historian J.P. McLean in 1907, just as cordially as though she had been white and free. April 24th, Richard McNamara and his wife Jenny joined, and pretty soon others are impressed. McNamara never heard of the Shakers before this, but was impressed with them, and he liked their manner and plain, neat dress. The 3 Shakers were impressed with his command of Latin, Hebrew, and Greek, and with his sound religious thinking. Soon after his conversion, nearly all the members of McNamara's church who lived in the area at Beedle Station became Shakers. And that included much of William Beetle's family. Now, I'm going to digress here just for a second. About 7-8 years ago, the Historical Society worked with the Lebanon Theater Company and put on a performance of what was called Murder at the Museum. And the person who was murdered was a fake Shaker historian. And I was asked to write 4 stories which were fake. And I am so very proud of these 4 stories. And one of them, which was never heard, because the character, the gunshot killing him, went off before the punchline was given. So I'm going to tell you all 4 stories. They're very brief, and you will be the first group ever to hear the punchline of the last story. Like all good jokes, there's a bit of truth involved in them. Mother Anne Lee was the founder of the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, or Shakers. In 1774, Revelation had selected her a band of followers from England to America to avoid persecution. Mother Anne arrived in August 6th of 1774 in New York. Here and her group stayed for nearly 2 years before moving to Albany, where the Shakers settled and their unique communities left behind and developed and thrived. Her husband, Abraham, who soon afterwards deserted her, accompanied her to America. Also among her handful of followers in the colonies were John Hocknell, who provided the funds for the trip, his son Richard, Mother Ann Lee's brother William Lee, and his two daughters, Nancy Lee and her sister, one of the great and most famous for her culinary dishes, Sarah Lee. Okay, one down. Okay. The Shakers were very inventive and making many of the items and devices we use today. They invented the modern day clothespin, the Shaker broom press, made flat brooms like the ones in your home now. They were the first one to package seeds and sell them to the public, or the world, as the non-Shakers were called. A Shaker's sister invented the circular saws. Shakers invented small containers used for dispensing spices on food, and that is why we call these such things as salt and pepper Shakers. That's the worst one. That's the worst one. Okay. The first Shaker community west was Union Village, established here in Warren County in 1805, 4 miles west of where we are today. From here, other communities developed. There was South Union in Kentucky, near the Tennessee border. West Union in Indiana, near the Illinois border. North Union, near Cleveland, what is now Shaker Heights, Ohio. Items made at these Shaker communities were highly prized for their quality and workmanship. Goods made by Union Village, South Union, and alike were sought by consumers from all over the world. It soon was well known that if you want the very best quality, all you had to do was look for the Union label. Okay. And now, the last one, the one no one has ever heard. Okay. When a person from the world became a member of the highest order of the Shakers, they had to relinquish all their personal goods in a public ceremony before the entire Shaker community. These possessions, because they were acquired outside of the Shaker society, were considered evil and ill-gotten gains from the world. That's why they're often referred to as booty. A new member of the Shaker ritual would figuratively and literally cast aside the worldly items. As the new Shaker danced about, waving the items to and fro, he or she would sing a chant whose lyrics had been made their way into modern society. At every Shaker induction ceremony, one could hear the new convert and the haunting phrase, "Shake, shake, shake your booty." Okay. Well, now back to the rest of our story. Okay. Also around that time, Francis and Polly Beetle became Shakers. As I mentioned, some people say he was a brother, but he was not. It was probably very, very difficult for Beetle to see parts of his family become Shakers. Part of the problem was the Shakers, being separatists, were secretive, and being secretive, people always don't like things that are secret, so they're always wondering what's going on over there. Between 1810 and 1820, there were nearly a half dozen mob actions of some sort against the Shakers. In almost every case, members of the Beetle family were there. In June of 1810, charges were made against the Shakers in the Western Star newspaper here in Lebanon by a Colonel James Smith of Kentucky, who at one time was a Shaker, and some of his family members were. The title of the pamphlet, this takes up half the pamphlet, "Shakerism Detected, Their Erroneous and Treasonous Proceedings and False Publication Containing in Different Newspapers Exposed to Public View by Disposition of 10 different persons living in various parts of the state of Kentucky and Ohio, accompanied with remarks." That is the title. More charges were made by the groups of Shakers, defectors, among them William Beetle's grandsons, John Davis and John Beetle. Now, the John Davis is a son of Susanna Beetle and her husband Jonathan. The John Beetle is James Beetle's oldest son. Both these men were at one time Shakers and then left, but they thought they saw the light about these Shakers. Monday, August 27th, 1810, a mob somewhere ranging 1,500 to 2,000 people. That's more than people who lived in Lebanon at that time. Partially raised by John Davis, are marching on Union Village. Some of them have guns, some bayonets, fixed on poles, hatchets, knives. They're Colonel William Schenck, the founder of Franklin, General William Schenck, the founder of Franklin, Matthias Corwin, who was a member of the Ohio General Assembly and father of Tom Corwin, the great governor, and Judge Francis Dunleavy, whose brother John had become a Shaker, tried to calm the mob down. A list of demands were being given. They were claiming that children were being tortured, people were being forced there, there was murder taking place, there was human sacrifice, there were orgies going on. And one demand was that old William Beetle be permitted to see his grandson, Jonathan Davis. They love to recycle names here, even in the same generation. So Jonathan Davis, and there are two Jonathan Davises, they're cousins. This Jonathan Davis was a son of Lydia Beetle and Elijah Davis. William Beetle wants to see him. It was alleged that the boy tried to leave the Shaker, but it was brought back against his will. Benjamin Young, in the Shaker notations of August 27th, 1810, wrote, "This day occurred in the county of Warren, now Union Village near Lebanon, the state of Ohio, one of the most extraordinary instances of unconstitutional proceedings and the most formidable appearance of infringements of the right of consciousness that have ever been witnessed in this country. A body of 500 armed men equipped in uniform and military order and their officers appeared on the grounds before the meeting house, and by committee of about 12 appointed for that purpose demanded of us that we should renounce our faith and practices, our public preaching, our mode of worship, and quit this country. So give up what you're worshiping and leave." This very extraordinary attempt began to be agitated principally through the instrumentality of a certain John Davis, John and Robert Wilson, and John Beetle, who had apostolized from the faith and became bold in wickedness and false accusations against the believers, whereby those who had long waited for false witnesses to accuse the believers for something criminal had at length furnished with a sufficient matter to answer that purpose. Old William Beetle, they should be permitted to see his grandchild, a son of Elijah Davis, alleged taken away. We replied that the child is under the care of his own parents, but we have no control over him, that we did not usurp parents' rights, but we doubt the child had no problem being seen by his grandfather. There was a Captain Culbreth. He wanted to attack the Union Village. Judge Dunleavy said, "No, you shouldn't." They both tried to arrest the other. One being a judge, one being a military man. A committee of 12, as mentioned, and only 3 of the Shakers were allowed to be part of that committee. But eventually, cooler heads subsided and things backed off. Then on December 16th of 1813, a Shaker record said the following of James Beetle, the son of William. "A violent mob came today in the employ of James Beetle, and who has previously left the society. His present aim was to take his children away by force. The house door being closed and barred, they took a battering ram and broke a door in two, then rushed in and committed considerable violence and abuse, but failed to get the children, as a shameful day of riot they had dispersed for the night." A couple of weeks later, another mob came by. It's now December 29th. After first gathering at Beedle Station, they were trying to prove to referees that James Beetle's children were being abused, but were not successful. However, for the sake of peace, the children's indenture to a Shaker trustee was given up. And on the 30th, Shakers recorded that James Beetle came in the morning and dragged off 2 youngest children against their will. They went off screaming and hollering. The mother and the 2 oldest children had fled to some other quarter to avoid violence, enjoy their own faith. On March 9th, 1812, William Beetle wrote his last will and testament. He died on January 30th, 1814, and his will was presented to Judge Francis Dunleavy on February 14th of 1814. It began, "In the name of God, amen. I, William Beetle of the county of Warren, in the state of Ohio, being weak in body but of sound memory, blessed be the Almighty God for the same, do make and publish this my last will and testament." His ill feelings toward the children who left the Shakers was quite clear, or at least his ill feelings toward the Shakers. "To my beloved wife Esther, 1/3 of all my estate, both real and personal, I further give her the occupancy of the best room of my dwelling house, together with the privileges as will render her comfortable as long as she remains my widow." To his daughter Esther, to his daughter Phoebe Mulford, who did not join the Shakers, by the way, and her heirs, 100 acres of Section 28 in which she resides, and 1/2 of the piece of land on the south side of Section 35, formerly containing the whole piece of 172 acres. Now, formerly containing the whole piece, I think that means she only gets 86 acres. I think that's what it means. But Section 35 is right over here. So Beetle, who owns all of this 640 acres here, also owns part of the south over here. Or as we're looking over here, this is all his property, but he also owns part of this section right there. Now, to his daughter Mary Hull, who did not become a Shaker, he left 100 acres of Section 28 and 1/2 of the Section 35. To his grandson John Davis, he left 100 acres of land in Section 28. That is the Beedle Station section that his father Jonathan Davis had formerly lived on, and 100 acres where Elijah Davis, his uncle, also once a Shaker, had once lived on the east side. To his grandson, John Beetle, he left 100 acres of land in Section 28, being the land formerly surveyed for his father, James Beetle. I also give and bequeath the land on which I now live, being the part of the Section 28, supposed to be 140 acres, and bound on the west by lands of Jonathan Davis, formerly lived on the east by John Hull. So, it is my opinion, since this cabin is located right about over here, I believe this was once the property of Jonathan Davis, that son-in-law. So the cabin is that little dot right there. So he's giving to John Beetle land on the west, which was once Jonathan Davis's property. So I think that's whose cabin we have here. To his son James, and he gave $10. Now, I'm not quite sure James is standing. Now, James was a Shaker, but he left. By the time of his death in 1814, James is the one tugging his children out of the Shakers. So whether or not the will was never corrected, or William is still holding James responsible for being a Shaker, I'm not quite sure. To Susanna Davis and Lydia Davis, whose husband became Shakers, they got $5 each. Now, Josiah Morrow speculates that these requests, no doubt, is that these children were Shakers, and to give it to them was to give it to the Shaker Society. I had never thought of that, but perhaps that was the case. The co-executors of the will included my trusty friend, John Davis, my grandson. John Davis really did hate the Shakers. He really did. Then on July 31st of 1817, Davis is about 33 years old, he raised another mob to go against the Shaker to try and retrieve his cousin, Jonathan Davis. So John is once again the oldest child of Susanna and Jonathan, his cousin, is the youngest child of Elijah Davis and Lydia, and William Davis is Jonathan's older brother. We'll come into this too. Jonathan had left the Shakers, but his father had sent some Shakers to bring him back. 30 to 40 men came with a constable and arrested the brethren who took the boy. The following is an account of which happened according to William Davis, a Shaker, and the older brother of Jonathan. Jonathan Davis and Richard McNamara were painting Marble Hall at this time. When they saw this mob come, they ran into the mill house, according to one account. Sometime in the month of July 1817, my youngest brother, Jonathan Davis, ran away from school where my father, Elijah, had placed him in the town of Lebanon to John Davis, his cousin. My father and I went for the boy, but John Davis and others forbade us to have anything to do with the boy, stating that they would protect him from his father by the shedding of the last drop of their blood. Sometime after, myself and 4 others went to the place where they were at work and went forward, and I said to John Davis, "Be civil. We want nothing to do with you. We wish only to take Jonathan to his father." Davis then left and turned to Wallace. I'm not quite sure who Wallace was, with his knife drawn. Wallace apparently was a Shaker. At this time, Wallace showed a spear to Davis and bade him stand off. Then we had gotten about 50 yards with the boy. John Davis passed with a knife and a club, stating he would soon have help and take the boy from us. He then drew the knife as if to strike. One of us then stopped the knife with a stick. He drew it again and stopped in like manner, which ended the attempt of striking. He also at the same time collected a mob who came to take the boy. They surrounded the house where the boy was, but the boy made his escape through the midst of the crowd and went into the woods. I do further testify that we did not have any intentions of injuring said John Davis, nor other people. Our only object was to bring the boy to his father and mother. Some of the people were arrested, including Richard McNamara, although he was acquitted. There was, however, some revenge the Shakers did have on the Beetle. And this is through Francis Beetle, who was somehow related to William, but as I mentioned earlier, not his brother. He had 80 acres in section 23, as I mentioned. Around 1819, he had a vision that a curse should be placed upon the village of Lebanon, and because of all these mob actions, and that a blessing should be placed on Dayton for the kindness the Shakers received in their community of Watervliet. At this time, both towns were almost identical in population, just under 2,000 people. Francis was joined on horseback by Richard McNamara. They rode through both communities. In Lebanon, they waved their hats, yelling, "Woe upon all the prosecutors." It took them at least 5 hours or so, if not longer, to get up to Dayton, and they put a blessing on all kindly souls. Shaker historian Edward Demings Andrews, in his book, The People Called Shakers, called this a curious story and said that according to the tale, the progress of Dayton dated from that event, convinced the community was blessed by holy men of God would surely prosper, and people moved into that town. In fact, in the 1820, Lebanon and Dayton were almost the same size. Lebanon was actually slightly larger. By 1840, Dayton had a population of 6,000, Lebanon 1,300, and by 1890, Dayton had 61,000, and Lebanon only had 3,100. In 1844, Malcolm Worley, the first Shaker who lived over here, died. Like many of the Shakers, the entire family, early Shakers, the entire family joined the community when they were adults. Some stayed, some didn't. But the three of the children were now suing the Shakers, saying their father was insane when he gave his property to the Shakers. The case went all the way to the Ohio Supreme Court, and Thomas Corwin, the great citizen of Lebanon, defended the Shakers. If they won their case, the Hart, this property right over here, would become non-Shaker, so it'd make a donut hole in the middle of Union Village. And Corwin said, George Fox, the man who founded the Society of Friends, the Quakers, wore leather breeches and did many eccentric things. Martin Luther threw an inkstand at the devil, but Quakers will not admit that George Fox was crazy, and Protestants will not admit that Martin Luther was crazy. Neither can it be allowed that Malcolm Morley was crazy, because in a deed drawn by himself, he chose to give his property to this peculiar people. Well, they won, and it stayed part of Union Village. Eventually, the people of the Beetle family started moving away. John Davis eventually moved to Texas. Some of the Shakers, Jonathan Davis, moved to Indiana when he became older. Section 29, as I mentioned, was always reserved for religious purposes. Then in October of 1842, when it was eventually sold for the very first time, it was bought by the Shakers. They sold that property to the United Brethren Church in 1912, and in 1929, the Arlebine Home sold it to the state of Ohio for what is now part of LCI. It is not known how long the former Turtle Creek Church functioned. The Western Star did report in 1824, on October 9th, that an unknown man on September 23rd was traveling on foot from Cincinnati to Chillicothe. There you go, that's a walk. He's going north. Now, I think he's going north to eventually go east, but he hitches a ride on a Mr. Holmes wagon who is returning from market in Cincinnati. It is 8 o'clock at night. They're passing over Muddy Creek on what would probably now be 741. In the dark, the wagon fell over the bridge and the stranger died. It was reported that he was interred in the burying ground of the Beedle Station Church, which is most likely the old Turtle Creek Presbyterian Church. In January of 1831, William Beetle's grandson, Job Mullins, advertised that he was selling his farm on which he now lives at Beedle Station. So in 1831, Beedle Station is still there. Also, by 1831, that blockhouse is still standing. It was torn down, they say, sometime in the mid-1830s. 5 years later, in August of 1836, William Mulford, perhaps Job's brother, and another grandson of William Beetle, announces a public sale on the premises owned by Joseph Beetle, deceased. Now, I'm not quite sure who Joseph is. Whether or not Joseph and Job are the same person, I'm not quite sure. But they're selling property at Beedle Station. In October of 1848, Warren County Auditor is advertising for construction bids to build an aqueduct over the Warren County Canal, crossing the Lebanon and Hamilton Road near Beedle Station. In an 1852, on March 5th, an article in the Western Star said, "Great yield of corn. Mr. Martin Brown, who owns the old Beedle farm on the canal, 4.5 miles southwest of Lebanon, raised on about 3/4 of an acre, 88 bushels of corn and 2 wagon loads of pumpkins." By 1850, it is not known if any other descendants were living on Section 28. 1856 map does not show anything on the map called Beedle Station. If you go to modern day maps, it's rather interesting. You will often find Beedle Station marked on the modern day map, but it's a good mile away. It's on the intersection of 741 and 63. They will put it there, perhaps because of the marker I'm going to tell you about in just a few moments. So they would put that mark, they identify that as Beedle Station when in fact it's down here. In 1946, Mary Gallagher Forgy researched at the early vital records of Beetle family for the DAR. You can find nothing on the graves of William and Esther Beetle. She died in the 1830s. Most likely they were buried by the former Turtle Creek Presbyterian Church. The church and all sites were seemingly lost to time until about a few years ago, when they started uncovering this. Much of the land around Beedle Station became part of Union Village, but none of Section 28 ever did. On September 23rd of 1945, a large boulder with a plaque unveiled in front of dozens of spectators, remember them descendants of the Beatles family, at a roadside park at the intersection of 741 and 63. Marion Snyder, the local historian and chairman of the dedication, was there and commemorate Beedle Station as the first settlement in the Sims Purchase. In 1974, after interstates had been around for 15 years or better, the rock was unceremoniously moved to a new location in front of the Ohio Department of Transportation, District 8, ODOT. Only the rest stop was closed. There was no need for a rest stop on 63 anymore. Only 2 people were present, James Cochran, a descendant of William Beetle, and local historian Marion Snyder again. Both Beedle Station and Union Village are gone. Union Village as a Shaker community are gone. But with the discovery, or the rediscovery, if you will, of this cabin, which I believe belonged to Jonathan Davis on the original section 28 of Beedle Station. We're going to learn a lot more about the Beatles. They're becoming much brought to the forefront, and perhaps the appreciation of Beedle Station as the first permanent settlement in Warren County would be more fully appreciated. Thank you very much.